On pretty much every Praxis exam or any teacher certification exam, you will encounter questions about assessments. The reason being is that the state wants to be sure that you are a data-driven educator and that you are using assessments properly to determine what your students know, what they don't know, and how you can intervene and help those students. So it's important you understand the different types of assessments and how it might look on the test. All right, so this is kind of a stripped down version of what I normally have in my books, but you can see here that I have diagnostic, formative, summative, performance-based, criterion referenced, norm referenced, and screening. Well, let's talk about diagnostic really quickly. A diagnostic exam is used to diagnose a problem. This is often used as a pre-assessment. You give students a pre-test to see where they are, where their knowledge is, and then you can plan accordingly. Now, you can also use a diagnostic in the moment. So let's say you have a student who is struggling to read a certain passage or a certain sentence, and you want to figure out what type of phonics issue the student is having. And so you might give that student a quick diagnostic to see that, oh, they're having trouble with their vowel teams, or, oh, they're having trouble with their silent E or something like that. And then you can quickly intervene. So diagnostics can be done as a pre-assessment, but they can also be done in the moment. And I would call these formative assessments because they inform your instruction. You give the diagnostic and then you make decisions based on that. The diagnostic is not used to penalize the student or put a grade in the grade book. It's really for the teacher. That information is for the teacher. The next thing that we have here in our table is formative assessment, which is something that I just talked about. When you see the term formative assessment, think inform instruction. You are using these types of assessments to make decisions, like I said about the diagnostic. Now, formative assessments are typically informal, and they come in the form of observations, checks, exit slips, things like that. So you're doing them in the moment. You might be walking around the room, observing how students are reading or interacting with whatever content you have given them, and you are making decisions based on that. You might move them in and out of groups. You might pull a couple out to the side and do some one-to-one instruction. Whatever it is, formative assessments inform instruction. They are ongoing informal assessments the teacher uses in order to make instructional decisions. Now, summative is different. Summative is at the end of learning. So think sum is like everything put together at the end. And they measure outcomes. So this is kind of like a final assessment. You're not really using these assessments to make decisions, although you could. You could use the information from a summative to move forward in the next unit lesson. But typically they are used to measure whether or not what you did worked. So for example, if we have a unit test or a midterm, a final, and even the state assessment, those happen at the end of learning. They measure mastery, they measure outcomes, and it's usually the end. And they are important because if you have been formatively assessing students along the way here, and you've been teaching and using formative assessment and making decisions and switching things up and using strategies and interventions, the summative should tell you if all of that worked. And if it did great, you can keep moving in that direction moving forward. Or you can say, gosh, those strategies didn't really work because the summative outcomes were not great. And so you can make decisions based on that. Now, a performance-based assessment, the student performs something. This is a high-level assessment, and it measures critical thinking and how the student applies their knowledge to the content, the standards, and things like that. This is typically done in a presentation, a science lab, perhaps. Essay assignments, essay tasks, writing tasks are considered performance-based assessment. The student is performing a task, and application is the key here. Student is applying the knowledge and doing a task or a performance based on that. Now, we also have criterion referenced, and I talked about this earlier. The criteria is the state standards. So the state standardized assessment at the end of the year is considered a criterion referenced exam. These are also summative assessments. They happen at the end of the year, at the end of learning. Your state standardized test is assessing whether or not students have mastered the standards over the course of the year. That's why it's so important to really look at your standards and teach students towards the standards so that they are successful on these criterion referenced exams at the end of the year. I know we don't like to be test prep teachers, right? We would rather be involved in engagement and inquiry and things like that. But the reality is that most students in most content areas will take a criterion referenced exam at the end of the year to measure those outcomes. These are considered summative assessments, and we want to prepare students for that. That's why using the standards to build your lessons is so important. Then, of course, like we had in the question earlier, is the norm referenced exam. This measures the norm on a bell curve. One of these types of assessments is the NAEP. So this is a national assessment that measures how students are doing in Alabama versus California versus Massachusetts versus Michigan. We are comparing student performance across the nation and determining, where students are performing well and where they are not. It is usually communicated in a percentile measure, and it's not really used for grades in the grade book or anything like that. A norm referenced exam is really for policymakers, administrators, educational leaders to understand how students are performing against other students in the nation. And then finally, we have screening. This is what we do when we're trying to determine where students should be placed. These sometimes are confused with diagnostic exams or pre-assessments. Diagnostic exams are really for the teacher to intervene and to make decisions that way. Screening is to place students where they need to go. So for example, you might do a reading screening on a new student who comes to the school to determine if the student needs intensive reading or interventions, things like that. You might do a language screening for an English language learner to determine if that student needs intensive ESOL instruction or if the student is fluent in English and can be mainstreamed into the general curriculum. So screening is usually done by the reading coach or the testing coordinator at the school, although some teachers do screening exams, but this is more to understand placement when it comes to classes for students. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this video on assessments. Make sure you really dig down and understand those different assessments. Remember, all of my study guides have very in-depth sections on assessments, how they are used, and what you should be looking for when you are faced with questions on the test when it comes to assessments. But understanding the difference between formative, summative, criterion referenced, norm referenced, that's all very important, not just for the exam, but to be an awesome educator as well. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and have an awesome day.